It's impossible to tackle everything at once. And that's what we really try to recognize. We really try to approach our writing with this idea of compassion for the consumer, that it really shouldn't rely on the consumer. The consumer should not have to be swimming upstream every step of the way to make the better decision. We really do believe that this should be on food companies to be tackling more of this stuff and on government regulation. But while we work on those things, we'll also see what we can manage on a personal level to support better systems.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Grant, and welcome to the Grateful Podcast, a place where we explore how each of us can eat, live, and lead to build a more sustainable world. I'm guessing if you're listening, you are as interested as I am in understanding better the impact of our food choices, not only on our own health, but on the health of the planet, the health of other people, on the health of animals. And my guest today is the perfect person to help us wade through this jungle of questions around the impact of our food choices. Today I'm chatting with Jerusha Klemperer, and she is the director of a really interesting organization, a media platform called FoodPrint. And FoodPrint has been set up to help us all understand better where our food comes from and also what role we can play as individuals to build a better system together. So in this episode, Jerusha and I chat about the concept of a food print and how we can reduce our food print. We talk about the limits of this and how we also need to find ways to influence systems change. We all chat about how some of the current solutions, like the boom in fake or alternative meats, have some limitations and that we should be asking some more critical questions there. And we also get some insights into her rich experience working in food systems from Slow Food USA as one of the co-founders of FoodCorps and finally as director of FoodPrint. And just before I chatted with Jerusha, I was fascinated to find out that she actually started her career as an actor on the stage and in films. So of course I had to start our conversation by asking her what it was about food that managed to lure her off the stage.
It wouldn't be quite fair to say that food lured me off the stage. I think that my career as an actor was not what I wanted it to be, and it's a very typical tale of not getting to work as much as I wanted to, largely, and not being in control of what I got to make. So I was in stuff that I didn't think was that great, and then I wasn't in very much. And I found that I spent the majority of my time doing things to support acting rather than acting. And then I wasn't getting to be super mindful about what those things were. That if I was going to choose how to spend my time, it was not to be doing these jobs that were just to make money, that worked well around my audition and rehearsal and performance schedules. So I just thought, if I'm spending 75% of my time on these jobs, wouldn't I rather choose how I'm spending 75% of my time more mindfully? And I wanted to have a sense of progress, moving forward, and then also making change in the world, which is something that I believe theater can do, but I didn't necessarily feel that what I was doing in theater was, making change. So I think a combination of all those things was okay, I think we're done here. And then I had to begin the process of figuring out what I would do with my life professionally. And I think once I think jobs can fill lots of roles for people. And I think it's totally fine for a job to be a place where you go and you clock in and you make money and you leave. And I also think it's great to have a job where it fulfills you and, propels you forward. And I think having had theater as my job, I thought, well, I'm kind of already accustomed to wanting a job. And I've given that up because I didn't like doing stuff that wasn't my passion. So let me figure out how to do something that's my passion. And the only thing that I got as excited about as theater was food. So I just started finding my way and figuring out, well, what do I have to contribute here?
And I think I read somewhere that you actually read the book Fast Food Nation, and that had a really big impact on you. And I was really interested to see that because it is exactly the book that launched my trajectory into food as well.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, I read it when I was in college and basically overnight became vegetarian because I cared about all these environmental issues and I never actually connected it to food before. I mean, this was a long time ago. So tell me a bit about that book, how you found it and what impact it had on you.
I love that that was the same turning point for you. Yeah, I mean, one of my best friends bought it for me, or maybe she bought it for herself, read it and was like, oh, you have to read this. But obviously that interest was already there. So, I was a vegetarian for ethical reasons, and I was very interested in food and obviously exploring where it came from. So she handed it to me for a reason. It didn't come out of nowhere. And I'm sure for you too, you picked it up for a reason. But I think it was, I'd always had a strong current of being an environmentalist, caring about animal welfare. It's why I was not eating meat, and a strong sense of wanting to pursue social justice and caring about inequities in the world. And reading that book, I saw that it was all of these things that I cared about that I thought were separate from my interest in food were actually totally intertwined, and that it made me want to learn about agriculture. It made me want to learn about policies. It made me want to learn about labor, like everything about where food came from. And before that, I'd really just cared about cooking and eating. And suddenly I realized that's like the very end of the chain, really, really tail end. And it's everything before that that has so much importance.
Mm. It's really interesting how one book can have such a profound impact around the world, right? Think of all the people out there sitting on a book they want to write, but wondering if it matters. And it's, stories like that tell you it does.
Yep.
And so you then found your way into Slow Food USA. Tell me more about what you were working on there and what you learned.
Yeah, I think when I started at Slow Food, it was very much not about changing people. It was about offering a place for people who really cared about producers, the people who made food, whether it was raising livestock or making cheese or making wine, that people who really cared about that process and wanted to support producers who were creating stuff in a way that was more ecological, that was more humane, and that shortened the distance between producers and eaters, which they called co-producers. I think that's really what Slow Food was when I got there. And it's really an organization that has morphed and changed a lot over the past decade plus. That was 2006 when I started working there, but that's really what it was. And it was a way to connect people who cared about those issues and connect people with small scale producers in their community. And then I think over time, the organization realized that there was an opportunity to engage people in advocacy and to say it's wonderful to support small scale producers and to support people who are doing things in a way that you believe is better. But also it's important to tackle some of the policy and systemic structures that are making it so hard for them, that are favoring large scale monoculture production, that means that they have to be swimming upstream as producers. And so over time, the organization opened up this kind of avenue of advocacy. And that was something I was very interested in. And so we decided to run an advocacy campaign. And this was, like 2008 when digital organizing tools were like very new. It was like, well, what is this? I was like, I guess I should get on Twitter. What's Twitter? And if we have a petition online, you can't just have people like click it and say they like it. You need to capture their information so you can follow up with them and let them know how to stay engaged in this. And then the next issue and the next issue. And these were all like brand new things, tools that had been kind of harnessed in the Obama campaign. And we were like, we should try to use that stuff. So the first campaign that we did was on school lunch, and it was the Child Nutrition Act reauthorization and trying to get more reimbursement money for schools per meal per child, which is really niche stuff to get people to care about school lunch who are not parents who have a child in school right now is really, really challenging. And we managed to do it. So that was exciting. But I learned so many things. We did a lot of things wrong, a lot of things right. And then we incorporated other kinds of campaigns. So not just like focused on a very specific policy, but also more lifestyle shifts. We did the $5 challenge, which was to create a communal meal that costs under $5 per person. And that was made up of ingredients that were good, clean, and fair, and sort of examining some of the challenges with that and with cost, and kind of really looking at the cost barriers to food, but also opening up lines of solution. Like, oh, well, if you use less meat and if you, do this and do that, you can stretch your dollars. But people created these beautiful communal meals all over the country that followed those parameters.
And what was the most eye-opening thing that you learned in that process?
I think the school lunch campaign, I learned so much. And I think something I thought about a lot when I went on to work in school lunch later, there was this like central question: what should be the amount of money that we're demanding that school lunch be raised, the reimbursement rate be raised? And there was an existing school lunch movement that was out there, and it was requesting a very specific amount of money that I think was very much tied to like what is realistic, what is possible, what could make a difference. And it was 37 cents more per meal per child. Can you imagine? Like you have to fight so hard for that. And as we were trying to think about how we could motivate this network of people around the country, we were like, that seems kind of a weird ask. It's so little. Like, is that something you can build a movement around? We should ask for $1. And the feedback that I got from people who had been working on this issue for a while was like, no, because that's crazy. Like no one's even going to listen to you. And so we really had to make a decision about what we wanted to do. And at the time we went with the $1 because we felt that that was the thing that could rally thousands of people around the country. And I think later when I went to work on school food more specifically, I really saw the pain point for those folks who had been organizing, that this was their chance to connect to a network of advocates around the country who would be speaking out about school lunch for the first time ever, to have so many people speak so loudly about it, and that we hadn't aligned with their ask and chosen our own. Like I really felt the pain of that later. Like maybe that wasn't the right move. So it was a real policy and organizing lesson for me to look back at it later.
And so that work seemed to spark an interest for you in school lunches as a challenge. Can you tell me about how you then went on to be a co-founder of FoodCorps and what that involves and what it looked like?
Yeah, well, to be totally transparent, I was not part of the very first conversations for that. But I think a good leadership skill is to identify the really smart people around you who have great ideas and hitch your wagon to their train. A colleague of mine at Slow Food had been part of some early conversations with some other folks. And it was through a conference, my fellow co-founders connected there over this idea of how could we tap into AmeriCorps funding, because at the time, Obama had just announced a commitment to putting more money towards AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps is something that only people in the United States would know about, but it's like a domestic Peace Corps. And it's largely for young people to receive a stipend to do service work around the country. And you're usually partnered with a local nonprofit or something like that. And originally the question was, how could we tap into AmeriCorps funding to help build the next generation of farmers? Over time, our goals shifted, and that evolved into connecting the AmeriCorps program with healthy food in school. And so that meant school gardens, healthy food lessons, and changing what's on the tray at school lunch. So it was a kind of three-legged stool, and these service members would work on those issues. And so I was really interested in building young leaders, which is something that's continued to be a real strength of that organization. I mean, the service members from FoodCorps have gone on to do such amazing things, both within food systems work and without. Many of them stayed in education or went into public health, but also many of them are doing work in local food sourcing and distribution, garden educators, farmers, and FoodCorps has continued to work on policy. So both working with the service members and then also working on policy. And I've gotten way off of what you asked me, which is sort of what interested me in it. But I'll be honest that school lunch was always a challenge for me to get interested in, just like not being that connected to the school environment. I didn't have kids. School lunch looked really broken to me. It seemed to me to be this like reflection of everything that's wrong with our food system. It was kind of like a fast food restaurant inside a school. But as I dug into it, I found it was like all of these issues. It was so interesting. And school food service providers, both the people in charge of these programs and then also the people making the food, were facing such enormous challenges and like being really creative in so many situations and finding solutions. There were, lots of examples around the country of people creating better options, even within this system that's so confined.
Yeah. And what were some of the most kind of inspiring or heartwarming things you saw during your work there?
I mean, for me, it was always the leadership development. I was the communications director at FoodCorps, and I got to work really closely with service members to kind of tease out their stories and help tell their stories. I made a few different videos with service members. I coached them on talks that they would give, TV appearances they would do. I mean, and those experiences were so meaningful to me to just help people find their voice literally and figuratively and to help convey the power of their service to other people. And so, I mean, it sounds so cheesy, but the first thing that came to mind was helping a service member prepare for an appearance on the Rachel Ray show. She's like a Food Network star in the US. So she's got, a daytime talk show. She's been on like 10 different cooking shows. She has cookbooks and cookware. She even has a line of pet food. I think she's just like a mega star. And she had one of our service members on the show, and I got to bring this young person and their mom to the Rachel Ray studio and just help them prepare. Like, this is how you tell the story of what you're doing in schools and how important it is that all kids have access to healthy food. And of course, this young woman just totally nailed it, knocked it out of the park. It was so rewarding. So, it was, for me, that leadership development part was so meaningful and important. And it's a ton of young women, as long as we're talking about developing female leaders, it was majority women who went through this program, and watching them become young leaders was always really exciting for me.
So aside from that communication piece, what were some of the other leadership skills you saw them build that went on to serve them in their careers in this space?
Yeah, I mean, as teachers, obviously, to be confident voices in front of a classroom of students, also to be advocates within their school community, saying, I need these resources for the garden, I need these resources for my classroom. School environments are really intimidating. They can be bureaucratic, and some of these service members would step in and just be there for 1 year or 2 years in a community where maybe teachers and administration had been there for decades. And so in every way, it was about building confidence and leadership.
And so at one point you left FoodCorps and came to where you are now, which is, I think, a really, really interesting role. Can you tell us a bit more about FoodPrint, which is where you're the director now?
Yes. So FoodPrint is a project of a foundation called the Grace Communications Foundation that's been a longtime supporter of initiatives that work on building healthy food and farm systems. And from early on, Grace saw that there was an opening, I think like 20 years ago. There was not a lot of information anywhere about where your food came from. And so Grace thought, there's work to be done on food systems, but then also there's work to be done just helping people understand the story behind their food. And so Grace had a website years ago called Sustainable Table that when I first got interested in these issues after reading Fast Food Nation, that was sort of what I found online was their information. So it's been around for a long, long time. And as of about 5 years ago, the foundation realized the website kind of needed an overhaul, was ready for new life, new framing, that the world around it had changed a lot and needed to find a new identity, and that they wanted to reshape it as something called FoodPrint. And then I came on board to help figure out, okay, well, what can this site be that helps people understand both the big systems issues with food, but also connect it to their daily lives and personal action. How can I shop, cook, and eat more sustainably while understanding that these problems can't be solved just at the supermarket or the farmer's market, that there are much, bigger systems at play. And we didn't come up with the name FoodPrint. It exists out there in the world already. Largely when people use it, they're talking about the carbon footprint of food. We're really trying to expand that definition to something more holistic beyond just carbon. So it's looking at the effect that food has on animals and planet and people. So that's food and farm workers, it's public health, personal health, and really getting people to see. And, and it's something you can't calculate, right? Everyone's always like, great, how do I calculate my food print? And we're like, well, we don't really do that because some of these things are not calculable. You can say, I can lower my food print by buying products that were not made using enslaved child labor, or, where the workers were unionized or where the farmers were paid a fair wage. You might not be able to calculate that, but you can say, I'm lowering my food print by eating those products, or, choosing certified humane labels on your eggs or chicken, or animal welfare approved label on your meat. That by choosing products where animal suffering was greatly reduced, you are lowering your food print. So it's a relative, shrinking it, lowering it kind of concept, even if we can't calculate it.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge, right? When you try and bridge social, animal, and environmental aspects, there's just so much qualitative data that you need to work with. So it's a nice way to frame it of, we can lower it, but we can't put an exact figure on it, and that's okay. So in the frame of FoodPrint, you do offer a lot of resources to people to help them, as you said, lower their food print and just better understand where their food is coming from. What do you think are the most important changes we can make at the individual and the household level, understanding there are the bigger system issues?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's going to be for the individual to choose what's doable and what matters the most to them. You could look at what are the biggest, easiest changes to make, something like reducing food waste, where so much of food waste happens on the household level. It's one of those few issues where you can say there are big food waste problems in the system writ large, but also a huge chunk of it is happening in your house. And that is something that people then can focus on and really make a difference on. And food waste is hugely important, both because of the resources that are wasted on that food that never gets eaten, but also because that food, when it goes to landfill, is a greenhouse gas contributor. So it's a major one.
I heard it described the other day as the world's stupidest problem, which I think sums up very well.
Exactly. You're like, come on, we can do this. It's hard, but we can do it. So that would be an example of I might put that forward as something that someone could tackle right away, or reducing packaging, reducing single-use plastic in your home. We do consider packaging and all of that as part of your food print. So we do talk a lot about plastic and packaging. But I do think it's really about what do you think is achievable and most important to you. If you're ready to eat less meat, that would be a great one. Also a big contributor to climate change. If you're ready to, say, okay, well, I want to focus on eggs, or I'm going to do better with my eggs, then it's like, choose that and we can give you guidance on how to work on that. But I think it's impossible to tackle everything at once. And that's what we really try to recognize. We really try to approach our writing and our podcast, because we have a new podcast, with this idea of compassion for the consumer, that it really shouldn't rely on the consumer. The consumer should not have to be swimming upstream every step of the way to make the better decision and say no to X or Y or Z. We really do believe that this should be on food companies to be tackling more of this stuff and or on government regulation. But while we work on those things, we'll also see what we can manage on a personal level to support better systems and better producers.
And better health for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I often have that conversation with people because as they start caring about food, go into a supermarket and look around and suddenly feel completely overwhelmed because they're trying to fix all of these big issues at the checkout and they're already busy and overwhelmed. And that's so important to realize that you can't individually solve it. We have to have these system changes, and you can start with smaller things that can still have a big impact if we all do them. Yeah.
Yep.
And I saw then you just to let people listening know who want to dive into this more, on the website, you do have these really great resources where, like you say, if you want to focus on eggs, you have a whole paper that dives into eggs. I'll pop them in the show notes so people can go and find them afterwards. So we probably both acknowledge that food systems are very complex, and in tackling these challenges, we face a lot of trade-offs. And I'm just interested to know from your side, what are you personally still grappling with in terms of trade-offs or open questions that you have about the food system and how we make it more sustainable?
I mean, I'm in a constant struggle to figure out how much what we do can make a difference. I think that the corporate power and consolidation, not just in the food system, but in the food system, is so powerful and such a dominating force that I'm constantly wrestling with, can we break this? Is this even a hopeful situation, And I think that in particular around climate change, I see an unwillingness, the part, for example, of the government in this country to really confront some of the changes that will need to happen. I'll just say in agriculture, though obviously that exists everywhere, and a willingness to confront big entities, big corporations, large scale farms, to say we just actually can't keep making food in this way, or we won't be here anymore. And I would say that's like a constant source of stress or anxiety, it's like, we're going to keep doing what we can do. But like, if we can't break that, what do we do?
Yeah. And I think that links nicely to something I wanted to ask you. So I saw on your Twitter bio, you have a little statement that says, eating, talking, mad about stuff, but trying to stay positive. So I think we've just touched on what you're mad about. But I've also been thinking a lot lately about the role of anger in creating change, and when is it hindering and when is it a fuel for us? And I wondered if you could speak more about how you see the role of anger in playing a role in creating change and how you work with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that sums it up for me, is that anger is always there for me and motivates what I do, but I don't find it useful in the communications aspects of what I do. The anger fuels me, but it isn't present in, for example, in my life on Twitter, or FoodPrint's voice on Twitter. I think there's a lot of angry discourse in the world that doesn't get us very far. And I really like to create spaces that are compassionate, empathetic, supportive, and positive. I think FoodPrint really tries to frame things more positively. Like, this is a great thing. Thanks for doing that. Like, bravo to this, and not booing the negative stuff. Obviously, a deep dive report on beef production, I guess you could call that a big boo for factory farming. But I think it's about using anger to propel work, but not to be like a present tension in discourse or communications.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking about too, kind of maybe acting from anger, but not with anger is a way to summarize that.
Yes.
And so on the trying to stay positive piece of that statement that you have on Twitter, what are some of the good news stories or initiatives or groups you're engaging with at the moment that give you that positivity and inspiration?
I mean, it's a really hard time to stay positive right now. I just want to acknowledge that this moment in time is a particularly challenging one for so many people. Mm-hmm. But, here in the U.S., which is what I'm most familiar with, all of the grassroots food organizations and local farms and farmers, like, they are all still fighting the good fight and thriving and feeding people. And I think, like, for example, when the coronavirus pandemic hit in the U.S., there was this sense that, like, well, people have bigger things to think about than food. And actually, it was like, no, food became this, like, really central question. And it was a real opportunity for all of those local food hubs and providers and communities to thrive and shine. And we really saw that in our moments of greatest need, that this local food system that we've all been championing and singing the praises of and relying on, that it can be there for us and that it is a good solution in various, different situations. So I found that very positive. I'm always moved and inspired by the small farms and producers and, frankly, small restaurants and food business owners who've had such a tough time these past 2 years, but they have persevered and fed their communities. And I find that really, really inspiring.
And innovated and adapted at rapid speed. That was phenomenal to watch. Yeah. You mentioned earlier you do have a new podcast, which I recommend everybody checking out. And it's called What You're Eating. So we'll pop that in the show notes as well. And the episode I just most recently listened to was about alternative proteins, this plant-based meat space, which has been a massive hype for, I guess, the last 5 or 6 years at least. And what I really liked about your podcast is that you are asking some critical questions about this topic, which I don't think are being asked enough. So could you just summarize a few of the key insights you have about this space from the podcast it's a bit of a teaser for people to go and listen to the rest of the episode?
Yes. And then after that, if they want to dig even deeper, we have like a 30-page report on this stuff as well. Yeah. With this, we wanted to, we're all for eliminating the factory farm animal industrial complex. So, the first instinct is to be really excited about any product that could help eliminate that. But also, I would say FoodPrint has a healthy skepticism of ultra-processed food and generally the system that props up. Monoculture farming of crops like soy that eliminate biodiversity everywhere that they are, that require like a really heavily chemical way of farming that, pollutes waterways and is bad for farm workers. So anything that's made out of like a big old ton of processed soy wheat we're going to be kind of scratching our heads and looking at. But obviously there's a trade-off, and if these products could actually supplant industrial beef, then we'd have to say like, okay, it's great. So we went to look at these questions, like what are these products made of? They promise to be good for you. They promise to be better for the planet. So let's look at those two claims by looking at what they're made of and actually, are they better than beef production, which in terms of emissions, they absolutely are. No question about that. But that only works if they're replacing beef. So that was the other thing we really wanted to look at was like, well, we see that sales of these things are really rising. That must mean that sales and production of beef are declining. Spoiler alert, they're not. So then, okay, are these products doing what we need them to do? So there's just, I would say, a healthy amount of skepticism there. And then we just start looking at like, well, what else could you be eating then? Because the answer is not, well, go ahead then and just eat the industrially produced beef burgers. It's not that. We don't support that. So listen in to 2 episodes on the podcast to find out the answers to all of those things. And then the second episode about fake meat just looks into that question of like, well, where's this hype coming from? Why is everyone so excited? Is it because of the money to be made? And who is it who's making money off of these?
Yeah, I did a study tour in California in 2015, which was kind of the beginning of this alt meat boom. And the figures that were already floating around then, all I could kept thinking was, wow, what if we were investing this amount in some of the bigger systemic challenges in the food system and not just jumping on the latest, IP opportunity. Yeah, it's very interesting. So thanks for raising that, and it'd be great if people will go and listen to that and have a think about it. And it's always about the baseline too, right? What are those products replacing, as you said? And as a vegetarian, I go into the supermarket and I'm like, why do they keep making so many new meat alternatives? I think what's really interesting in a lot of your work is, the role of storytelling. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how do you see storytelling and what role does it play in creating change?
Yeah, everyone's really excited to talk about stories and storytelling, and I'm a huge fan of stories. But I think I'm going to twist it a little because I think part of it is actually and a good story does this, breaking things down in a way that's clear and accessible and welcoming and demystifying. And I think a good story welcomes the listener in and has them come and, sit by your side while you tell them the story. And I think that's been a common theme for me in the storytelling that I try to do for organizations, which is how can I explain to you in the most friendly and welcoming and accessible way what it is we're trying to do here and make you feel like you're a part of it and you have something to add.
Yeah, just keeping everybody, in German they say on eye level, in the sense that, there's no expert and audience, that we're all eaters and we all have something to say and contribute in this space. That was an interesting journey for me, working in academia for so long and then writing a book, which I knew I wanted to be really accessible and inviting, as you said. And that process of changing my language and way of writing was really a whole kind of reconfiguration of the brain, but I'm glad I had to go through it. So this podcast is called The Great Full, and I like to ask all of my guests the same question at the end. What does living a great and full life mean for you?
I've had a lot of opportunity to think about that, I think, in the past 2 years, as life got very small for me, and I think for a lot of people, confined in a small apartment in a city where COVID was raging and I, not being able to see many friends or family and feeling the pain of that. So I think for me, a great and full life is very much about community. I really like to be in relation to other people, laughing with them, telling stories with them, supporting each other. And I think sometimes those are things you can do over Zoom or FaceTime or things like that, but that actually being with each other and being able to hug and all of those things are just so paramount. And so I think I really learned that for me, a great and full life has to include community. And I think in terms of my work, it's been sort of in feeling the lack of it, I've learned that a great and full work life has to include being able to go out and feel and touch and hear and see the food system that I am talking about. And that's been a real challenge of the past 2 years, and even to record a podcast entirely, from a desk instead of from being out in the field and, interviewing people in person and things like that has been challenging. And so I think a great and full work life for me has to include interfacing with soil and people and, all of the things that help me understand better what I'm trying to help other people understand better.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Grateful Podcast. If you liked it, then please go ahead and subscribe and share it with a friend. And I would love to get your questions answered here. So if there's something that you would like answered or explored on this podcast, just send me an email to podcast@thegrateful.com and I'll do my very best to get your questions answered here on the show. Music in this episode came from Blue Dot Sessions.